Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. Tanya Melich is a political activist, a feminist, an advocate, and an author. A couple of years ago, she wrote an excellent book called The Republican War Against Women. It's as pertinent today as it was the day she finished typing. It's really an exciting book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ronnie.
It has its suspense and its emotion and passion. You wrote it as a lifelong Republican.
Right.
You were born a Republican.
Well, more or less.
Yeah.
Yes.
I always say I was born a Democrat. I have a family and an FDR family.
A birthright Republican.
But you come from a family that was long active in Republican politics. Right. And it was, the Republican Party meant a lot to you.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell us about it. I mean, it was the Taft. Your father ran for governor?
My father ran for governor
of
Utah. My father was in the state legislature for many years. I worked in his political campaigns when I was a kid.
So you grew up the whole thing.
And when I came to New York to go to graduate school at Columbia, and then I married a boy from the Bronx, I went to work immediately in the Republican Party. I worked in John Lindsay's campaigns. I know you were a Lindsay person. I worked for Nelson Rockefeller. The big campaign emotionally in my life was 1970 when Charlie Goodell, who had been appointed by Nelson Rockefeller to replace Bobby Kennedy's seat when Bobby Kennedy was shot, and Buckley. You remember that?
Yeah,
Jim
I do.
Buckley.
Right.
So I've been involved with the Republican Party forever, at home and then here in New York.
Well, up until Buckley, and I didn't know too much about Buckley, and Buckley was the other Buckley's brother, and so he was.
Right.
Those were what we would call, as a Democrat, an enlightened Republican. I mean, they were liberal in social policy.
Right.
And they were very likable people. I mean, you would never had fear if they were elected president, Eisenhower and people like that, right?
Yes.
So then...
And then the one that we nearly forgot, which was Jacob Javits.
Jacob Javits.
And I remember all of his major stands and what happened to him. Right. But it all changed, as I describe in my book.
Right, and you start the book where? At the 1992 convention in Houston.
Right.
The Republican convention. And I remember meeting you there because my husband was writing from there, and we saw you on the floor, and you were not a happy person.
No.
But the book really says that it started with a Goldwater campaign.
Yes, it did.
So what happened? Explain it to us.
Very quickly, the Goldwater people...
Let's say what happened. It's the change in the party.
Yes. This is a story...
The party went from a party of moderation to a party of really extremism.
Right.
And you trace that.
And let's do it fast because I'd like to talk about the present. This is a story of 1964, of how the Republican Party changed. The party of civil rights became the party that did not support civil rights. And the Goldwater campaign looked around in 1964 and realized that they could not win against against Lyndon Johnson unless they invaded the South, invaded it in a political sense. And out of that grew what became the backlash strategy. And they went after voters who were against the civil rights movement.
And that's called the Southern Strategy?
The Southern Strategy. And from there, as the years passed, something else happened. The women's movement came along. And the people who had been involved in the Southern Strategy looked around and found that, my goodness, there were also people who didn't like what the women's movement stood for. So that the backlash strategy moved from not just being looking for voters in the South who were against civil rights, but voters in the North, and then voters who were against what the women's movement stood for. So that battle began in the 70s, and the growth of the religious right developed at that point, partly because of Roe v. Wade, the decision that, abortion rights. So much to tell, so little time.
I know.
And as a result of all of this, by the time we got to 1980, the religious right, in joining with the new right groups, had put together a backlash strategy that said if you were afraid of minorities getting a lot of support and you were afraid of women getting too much power, then you should vote for us. At the same time, the attempt was made to try to hold on to people like me. And the story of my book is the battle that many of us had through the 80s trying to beat back what inevitably
within the party
we lost.
Right. And it was a very, I mean, it's very interesting. You covered the ERA, the whole national, the state's ERAs and the national legislation for the constitutional amendment.
Right.
And that provided the object for everybody's animosity and took off. And you had the Roe v. Wade and the choice issue, and you even had party issues about equal representation within the party to go to nominate. What you stress is how important what the platforms and the issues that come out of conventions, political conventions that are nominating candidates, how important those are. And that's where you took your struggle. The Republican women who were more enlightened and believed in these things, fought time and again in platform hearings to try to get their issues. And so as we come today where we now have, what is the difference? The moral majority, the Christian right, is it all the same?
No, they have a variety of points of view within their constituencies. You can talk about the new right, which is essentially I think people who are supply-siders and who are supply-siders are people who believe in trickle-down economics, which is what this presidency is all about, as was Reagan. These are people who...
was that the force that propelled Reagan?
No. I think you have to understand it's the new right and the religious right, which are two different groups of people who came together. The new right isn't particularly interested in social issues. They are more interested in economic issues. The religious right, on the other hand, is the group that is most concerned about women having an equal place at the table, women having a right to choose, women being looked on as equal citizens, and that group includes people who are head of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Family Research Council, groups of that sort. And so there is rather an unhappy marriage between these two because the new right includes many libertarians, and libertarians are quietly pro-choice. So there is a tension within the party that still shows itself. But as far as the president is concerned, this convention that is about to come to us, it's not going to make much difference. This is a convention that is completely controlled by the president, by Karl Rove, and they're not going to. If there is any dissent at this convention, within the convention, it will be because it's okay to have a little bit of dissent.
Who are the figures that we are familiar with now that represent the new right? Does Cheney represent the new right?
Yes,
yeah,
yes.
I think he would if he was let loose.
Cheney is a very good example of the new right. As you know, I come from Utah. He comes from Wyoming. He and I were both interns for the Ford Foundation many, many years ago. And while I barely know Cheney, Cheney is a libertarian. He is not,
which really translates into less government control.
That's right.
Free market.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Except that this particular administration, it's not really free market because it's defined by seeing that the people at the top get the best tax breaks, and the assumption is that with all of the tax breaks at the top, it will trickle down to people at the middle class and lower.
So have we ever had a time where the Republican Party or any party has really looked the way this does?
I think what makes this worse is that the social attitudes that I described that grew over quite a bit of time, and the economic attitudes have been there. But since the end of World War II, the Republican Party has been an internationalist party. And even though my father's candidate in 1952, Robert Taft, was considered an isolationist, if you go back and read about him, he really wasn't an isolationist. After we won World War II, the United States joined the community of nations. We helped to found the UN. And the idea that we would go it alone unilaterally in this Iraq war is a complete turnaround from the history of not only the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party. So we have a whole new dynamic that we never had before W.
Are you still a member of the Republican Party?
No, I last week went down to the Board of Elections, and after much strain and stress emotionally, I am now an independent. I just could not become a Democrat, and we could discuss that, but this is not what we want to talk
Right.
about. But I am now an independent.
Are there many people like you? Is the old, do we call it the old guard? What do we call people like you from the Republican Party?
Well, there are, I guess you would call us former Republicans.
No, but I mean, are there any of people like you still in the Republican Party?
Oh, a few, but not very many. If you look at the polls, the number of people within the Republican Party supporting George Bush is 88, 89%. What has happened to people like me is that they have left the party at 3 different times. The first time was in 1980. You remember John Anderson ran, and then after he was defeated by Ronald Reagan, he became an independent. So there was a group of people who left the party at that point, and many of those were fiscal conservatives like myself. The battle was partly over supply-side economics. The next group that left in '92, which is when I walked out of that convention in Houston, and that was over principally social issues. That was over the right to choose. It was also over the environment. It was over a lack of tolerance, a lack of respect for people who were different than the people in that convention. And then the last of it, I think, came in '96 with Bill Clinton. There was anger over what the Gingrich Congress had done in '95 and '96, and the switch there was mainly with women. It was the first time since we got the vote, Ronnie, that women elected the President of the United States. If we had not had the vote, Bob Dole, and this is according to the exit polls, Bob Dole would have been our president in '96.
This is what was called, or is called, the gender gap.
Yes.
Is it? Does it still exist?
Yes.
Is it showing in this election?
Yes, it's major. It's major.
And then it goes back, we could have a long philosophic discussion about how women view public policy. I just want to clear up one thing. When you say you're a fiscal conservative, it seems to me the Democrats are increasingly moving to that position. The majority are opposed to the tax cuts, are they? Can I say that? Or most of the spokespeople?
No, I think that you would find that the constituency that I'm talking about, some of them became Democrats, and many of them are like me, and there are a few that are still Republicans that have taken all these years to finally go down and change their registration, is that they are very upset by not having balanced budgets.
Right.
And the balanced budgets ideas essentially were introduced into the Democratic Party in a big way with Bill Clinton. And so that was a very attractive...
Another reason I see for the change.
Yes, in 96.
Yeah.
The idea that in 2001 we had a $100 billion surplus, and this year we have at least a $400 billion deficit, and this doesn't include all the costs of Iraq and Afghanistan, plus, as we all know, the needs that we have for homeland security costs here at home, the firemen, the first reactor, and so on, that thing. So consequently, if you're someone who was raised that we ought to try to balance our budgets, and you have this man who claims to be a conservative, fiscal conservative, this man being W, he's not. President Bush is not. And so you have people who were women, let's talk women again, who were upset first about the attitudes toward women by this wing of my former party. Then you have this lack of fiscal responsibility, which is very, very distressing. And then you have turning our backs on our international tradition, that was epitomized by Ike.
Yeah. Do you find, is there any criticism about the conversion of the religious principles and the public interest? I mean, the Republican Party seems to me to be totally now a party of religion.
Not quite, because if it was totally a party of religion, then I don't think it could function, because there is still an enormous support in both parties for separation of church and state. And there are very, very virulent disagreements that go on within the party over the separation of state issue. And it focuses sometimes in really strange ways. It focuses on Karl Rove saying that he meets with evangelical preachers to go and pass out literature for W, or it happens with meeting with the Pope and discussions that come out, and then you will hear a state senator from a Republican state senator say, you know, this isn't the American way, this isn't the way. So on the issue of broad attitudes toward separation of church within the Republican Party, it's very strong, as is, I believe, the issue of fiscal conservatism and internationalism. But that's talking about the broad-based. The people who are coming to New York for our convention outside of a few places, the New York delegation, for example, Maine, parts of Pennsylvania, California, these are people who have disagreements with the president on these issues I've just raised, but are not going to do anything that would make Karl Rove and his campaign team unhappy, because the campaign is so close that, and you being an activist party member, if your nominee came to you and said, Ronnie, I know you and I disagree on environmental protection, but we have to have a really unified convention here in New York, you would bite your tongue and say, I guess I won't say anything until this is over. And you saw something similar up in Boston. The Democrats, I've never seen the Democrats so unified. Well, the Republicans tend to be more unified. They tend to have their disagreements behind closed doors. And I think I can talk about that because I have been working to see that John Kerry wins the election. And what is interesting is to compare the differences between the culture of the Democrats and the culture of the Republicans, because they are different.
What is the difference?
Issues. Republicans tend to have very strong fights behind closed doors. They don't tend to very often to get out and air their dirty linen. What amazes me is how Democrats are always out talking loud and noisily.
It's very interesting, yeah. And then if you go back from the anti-war, the civil rights movement, the whole thing. You talked about how you were struck with the hypocrisy through your years. Now, I mean, for years, you did have the fight in private and then stood up for the public, but finally you had enough. Yeah. Maybe other people will too. I have several questions, and we're coming to the end, amazingly. One, do you think Bush really fooled people 4 years ago? Did he run as a more moderate person to the outside world?
I'm afraid so, and I was out speaking and talking in 2000. I was not part of the Gore campaign. I did vote for Gore, but what I kept saying wherever I went was that this man, George W. Bush, is a born-again Christian in a different way than Jimmy Carter was, and that he devoutly believes that he has been, that God has a mission for him, and that on the issues of a woman's right to choose, there was nothing that wasn't going to be done to see that we would lose Roe, that family planning would be brought back, that there would be attacks, as we have seen, against the United Nations family planning, the gag rule, we could go into that. So one of the things that used to surprise me is that I would get that question, and I'd say, this man is not a moderate. I said, this man is a radical. I even wrote an op-ed about it, pre-9/11. Not nobody, but very few people, except my colleagues who had been through these fights, said, yes, we agree with you, but we can't seem to break through. We can't seem to get the press to understand that this man is not like his father. and I had major disagreements with George Sr., but George Sr. was an internationalist. George Sr. was an old-line fiscal conservative who then got caught in the middle of the supply-side fight on the taxes. And so by the time we got to 2000 and George W. Bush, it was clear where he was going. What has happened has not surprised me at all, and I think it's partly indicated in my book.
George Bush, the senior, you portray, and I think most people do. I mean, he was an internationalist and all of that, but he grew up as a sexist. He just grew up in that kind of world with making jokes about women, right? And that came to haunt him. And also, he didn't appear to be as strong as he should have been. And you talk about that, the expediency in politics and the hypocrisy of politics. It's really it's always been amazing to me. And of course, I am not as strong a participant in party politics as you've been, because I don't know why, but explain what.
We live in a democracy that is based upon having a lot of diverse people working together. Consequently, it requires compromise. And the question is, how far do you compromise in order to get a bill passed, in order to get nominated? And it depends upon how far you're willing to go. And I tried for years, as did my colleagues, and we did compromise. But a point came when enough was enough. And then after 9/11, when we all needed to be together and things were not done right away within the year as it relates to New York City, Homeland Security, and we were having our Attorney General in the fall of 2001 harassing people over pro-choice issues. It was too much.
Yeah.
And you reach that point.
Right. People also need to be very tough and strong, don't they?
Yes.
So they
Yes.
they pick a point earlier, I think, in the line than you would to compromise.
That's right.
So
And
at
I
the
think-
time, I mean, it's a political process to define or to work within politics, right?
Right.
You have to constantly politic. You have to
Right.
constantly persuade and try to move to the next step and the next person, and it goes on. And too often we are stopped too soon in that process, and
right.
that's very hard. I was amused when you think about it. You did a profile of Phyllis Schlafly, and who, I don't know where she is these days. Is she working
she's
for
around.
George Bush?
I don't know whether she'll come to New York, but I wouldn't be surprised. She lives in Missouri now, not in, or Missouri, as they say, not in Illinois.
And what was the name of her organization?
The Eagle Forum.
The Eagle Forum, and that was, she was opposed to the ERA, she was opposed to any abortion and all of that, and they were opposed to childcare, that a woman's place is in the home, and that you stay and take care of your family, and the family was all important. And yet there she was traveling around very independently, not playing the role
Right.
she was. Babe Buchanan is another one that you talked about. I mean, they're all unbelievable.
Yeah. This administration, and this is true of all of the, let's start with Reagan, Bush Sr., all of the administrations, Republican and Democrat, have at least taken that part of the women's movement to heart. Condi Rice would not be where she was if we hadn't had the women's movement that you and I
Right.
started with others in the early 70s. You will notice that the Republicans have many women on their staffs. They have a lot of women who are participating. That isn't where the issues. That isn't where the problem is. The problem comes with how one stands on the issues.
And that's what we've learned. But then if we have the gender gap, we obviously have a lot of women who stand the way we would like them to stand on issues. It's a very interesting thing. What do you plan? You've always worked well with other parties. I mean, you believe in this collaboration, and you've believed as a feminist in the role of women and the importance of women and the issues that affect women. So you were a founder of the National Women's Political Caucus and worked here and all over with it and everything else. Where are we now with the caucus? We only have 2 minutes to do this.
Rather than just the caucus, I think we ought to talk about women.
Yeah, let's talk.
One of the things that is very exciting is that the under 30 generation is very active in this election. I am very pleased to say that all of the complaints about where the young women are not true now. If you look at the staffs on both the Republican and on John Kerry, I know less about the Bush campaign, but you will find that there are women schedulers, women advance people. There are women all through the campaigns. And I think part of it is due to the work that was done in the 80s, both with Republican women and with Ellen Malcolm with Emily's List.
Yeah.
So I'd say it's a different kind of women's movement, but there is a women's political movement, and I think that this new generation is first class.
And so you have great hopes for politics in the future.
Well, I don't know.
I don't know either. I shouldn't have generalized that way.
My difficulty is that this is a cliche, I think this election is so important because it relates not only to all of the social issues that we could talk about, but the environmental issues, the supply side, the obscenity of what's going on with the wealthy getting wealthier and the middle class barely holding on, and the poor is disgraceful. But the overriding issue is defense and foreign policy. And I think that's what's going to make the decision, and that's why I went supporting John Kerry in March of 2003. Because I thought he could be a good commander-in-chief.
Well, with that, we end this program. I've always had great admiration for you, and I'm very delighted to have had this conversation. And I hope that you keep on, and I hope people read this book, because it's really a very interesting analysis of where we are, why we are where we are today.
And it was 96 when it was
written.
written.
It's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.